Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a new commander from the Wilds of Eldraine precons, Gylwain Casting Director. This video is sponsored by Wizard of the Coast. You can pre-order your Wilds of Eldraine product using my link down in the description. That will really help out the channel at no extra cost to you. To see other cool folks who support my content, check out the description below. That also helps out the channel at no extra cost to you. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more for as little as $1. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Gylwain is a human bard for 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 white. He has a triggered ability whenever he or another non-token creature enters the battlefield. When that happens, you can either put a Royal Roll, Sorcerer Roll, or Monster Roll on that creature. These are token auras that are created and attached to that creature. A creature can only ever have 1 roll on them, so if you were to quote-unquote update their roll, you get rid of the previous one as a state-based action. Of these, I prefer the Monster Roll for each Gylwain trigger since the deck aims to be aggressive. It's not fast, so it's more mid-range, but giving +1/+1 and trample to creatures that plan on being huge is pretty busted. You might consider putting the Royal Roll on Gylwain when he enters the battlefield since it gives Ward 1, but that's not hard to overcome in a commander game, especially if it drags on too much. If you notice the Royal token, the other half is the Virtuous Roll, but that's not something Gylwain creates. This is the best roll in the deck though, but we'll see who creates this roll later on in the video. For now, my main strategy is turning my non-token creatures into monsters. What I absolutely love about Gylwain is that he's an enchantment commander without having to use strictly enchantments in the deck because he's creating an enchantment for each non-token creature entering the battlefield. This means that you can still abuse constellation effects while running more creatures than enchantments, thus keeping your threats. And one of the best constellation effects to abuse is drawing cards. Eidolon of Blossoms, Setessan Champion, and Tanglespan Lookout do some insane amount of work with Gylwain. Each time a non-token creature enters the battlefield, an aura is created, which will trigger all 3 of these cards, drawing you a card. Not only that, but Setessan Champion also becomes bigger since it gets a +1/+1 counter each time. So not only is it card advantage piece, but a huge beater as well. However, we'll see the rest of the beaters in the deck soon. And running so many creatures means that creature-based card advantage effects can be included as well, such as Beast Whisperer, Soul of the Harvest, Guardian Project, Primordial Sage, and the Great Henge. The first 2 aren't as strong since they trigger on cast, whereas the last 3 are better for triggering on entering the battlefield. As a bonus, the Great Henge can also tap down for double green and 2 life, while also potentially only costing 2 green if we controlled a big enough creature. Plus, it also gives a +1/+1 counter to that non-token creature that entered the battlefield. Watley Radiant Champion also provides a similar effect with her emblem, that can stack by the way. It is her ultimate, but since her +1 ability gives her a loyalty counter for each creature we control, she can reliably get that emblem the next turn after she comes in. And if she had any leftover loyalty counters on that, in 2 more turns we can get the emblem again. Her -1 ability is also amazing since it can pump a creature for that one-shot player eliminating creature. Oran Frostfang, Toski Bear of Secrets, and Thaddeus Juniper Ascendant also provide creature-based card advantage via combat. The first 2 are best since they trigger per creature dealing combat damage to an opponent instead of per opponent taking combat damage, like in the case with Thaddeus. As a bonus, Toski is indestructible and the Frostfang gives our attackers Death Touch, which is absolute insanity with Trample. If all of our non-token creatures have the Monster Roll, then attacking with Death Touch means only dealing 1 damage to a blocker and then the rest goes to an opponent's face. The deck draws so many cards that Reliquary Tower, Thought Vessel, and Decanter of Endless Water are naturally included. The first one doesn't take up a slot in the deck and, while the other 2 also function as mana rocks, the deck still prefers land-based ramp since it's green. That being said, Sol Ring is the only other mana rock in the deck, so we don't need to fear opponents' overloaded Vandal Blast. Going back to drawing cards off of Constellation triggers, the absolute best card for those interactions is Composer of Spring. When testing this deck, I was absolutely flabbergasted with this interaction. Since it triggers whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, if we had something like the previously mentioned Tanglespan Lookout, things get crazy. It also works with Eidolon of Blossoms and Setessan Champion too. Anyways, here's what happens. The non-token creature enters, triggering Gylwain, creating a roll on that creature. This triggers both the Lookout and Composer. If we arrange the stack in such a way as to have the Lookout resolve first, we draw the card. Then when the Composer's trigger resolves, we can drop a tapped land. However, if we controlled 6 or more enchantments, which is very likely since almost all of our creatures are going to be enchanted by a roll, then you can cheat in a tapped creature instead. This will trigger Gylwain, creating another roll, which triggers both the Composer and Lookout. So if you had a handful of creatures or kept drawing into creatures, you could realistically cheat into play all of your creatures from your hand. I absolutely love Composer of Spring, even more so in this deck. This interaction is so strong that you can also include cards like Amulet of Vigor and something like Nature's Revolt if you wanted to. That way our lands and creatures enter untapped thanks to the amulet, and your lands entering the battlefield will trigger Gylwain, continuing the loop. I am not running these, but you definitely could if you wanted to. There are other constellation effects in the deck that also help out with the main strategy, which is pumping your creatures for an epic beatdown. Calyx Guided by Fate puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature whenever he or another enchantment enters the battlefield. This can be placed on the same creature that entered that triggered Gylwain, or on a creature you're choosing as a threat. However, that's not all. Calyx also triggers whenever an enchanted creature deals combat damage to an opponent. When it does, you get to copy any non-legendary enchantment you control. Unfortunately, this only triggers once per turn, but that's enough to copy something like Greater Aromancy or Privileged Position. Neither of these enchantments protect themselves, but if we controlled any combination of the two of these, then they'll protect each other from targeted removal. While Privileged Position gives hexproof to all of our other permanents, thus being the best one, Greater Aromancy gives Shroud to our enchanted creatures, which should be all of the creatures enchanted by a roll. Since it also gives Shroud to enchantments, copying it has each copy protect the other. Best of all, it was recently reprinted in Wilds of Eldraine, where you can get it with this epic art and border treatment. There are other protective effects in the deck, but we'll see those soon. Going back to constellation effects that pump, Boon of the Spirit Realm is amazing here. It triggers each time a roll is created, as well as any other enchantment entering under control, giving it a blessing counter. Then, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each blessing counter on it. This adds up very fast, especially when we have Gylwain, Composer of Spring, and a card draw trigger on the board. Halvar, God of Battle, gives double strike to each creature we control that's equipped or enchanted. Thanks to Gylwain, each non-token creature enters the battlefield and becomes enchanted by a roll. This is essentially a 4 CMC way to give double strike to our non-token creatures. Not only that, but at the beginning of combat, we can swap an aura or equipment around. So we can move a roll to a creature without it if it's a better actor for it. Gylwain appreciates that. If that weren't enough, we can also cast Halvar as Sword of the Realms instead if we really needed a protective equipment instead. If you're finding it difficult to keep Gylwain around even with the Ward 1 from being royal, equip him with the sword. When he dies, he returns to your hand in order to be recast without that pesky commander tax. That being said, Halvar is the default side for this deck. Double Strike and Trample is no joke. And if you had Oran Frostfang in play, Double Strike and Death Touch means killing the blocker first, and then the rest of the damage is trampled over and then you hit again. So good. Gavany Township might seem slow, but it doesn't take up a slot on the deck and gives us something to do if we had the mana to spare, which shouldn't be that out of the ordinary in a half-green deck. Giving a +1/+1 counter to all of our creatures in the deck full of beefy monsters eventually adds up. That being said, not all of the beaters in the deck are developed via giving non-token creatures a monster roll and then pumping them up. Some creatures get pumped up all on their own. Aura Gnarlid, Yamamaya Enchantress, Eidolon of Countless Battles, and Catilda Dawnheart Prime are 4 such creatures. The Gnarlid only counts auras, but that's okay since all rolls are auras anyways. The Eidolon is busted because it also counts creatures. Not only is the deck creating enchantments off of non-token creatures, thus essentially doubling this effect, but it also creates creature tokens, which pushes this even farther. But we'll see those soon. Catilda also counts spirits, which is unfortunately only herself, but at least she also has flying and lifelink, which is amazing. While these don't have built-in trample, allowing them to be chump blocked, this is precisely why Monster is the default role chosen as mentioned in the beginning of the video. Giving trample to creatures like these is key. If that wasn't enough, the Eidolon and Catilda can grant this effect to another creature. Catilda can be cast as an aura via her Disturbed ability, transferring her abilities to that creature, and the Eidolon can be cast as an aura via its Bestow ability for the same effect. And these aren't the only effects like this in the deck either. There's All That Glitters, Ancestral Mask, Ethereal Armor, Helm of the Gods, Nettle Cyst, Michiko's Reign of Truth, and Sage's Reverie. All of these pump our creatures in some way dependent on how many enchantments or auras there are, with some having some other bonuses along with that. All That Glitters, Nettle Cyst, and the Saga also count your artifacts. The Mask counts all enchantments in play, and it's 2/2 each. The Armor gives First Strike, and the Reverie, which only counts auras, has the potential of drawing us a ton of cards when it enters the battlefield. And counting auras isn't a drawback since all rolls are auras. The Saga also returns transformed into Portrait of Michiko. It exiling and then returning transformed is actually important. This is a non-token enchantment creature entering the battlefield, so it'll trigger Gylwain as well as the other effects that trigger upon a creature and an enchantment entering the battlefield. so it gets a monster roll, giving it yet another +1/+1, and trample, making it yet another beater in the deck. Speaking of rolls and beaters, Olivier of the Wild Court is the card I mentioned in the beginning that creates the virtuous roll when she enters the battlefield. And not just that, but when she attacks as well. While she's the face commander of the precon, I much preferred building around Gylwain. That being said, she's well deserved in the 99. The virtuous roll is insane here, giving an effect similar to the previous ones. While it will override any monster roll already on a creature, putting it on a creature that already has evasion is amazing. This is why Rogue's Passage is in the deck. It doesn't take up a slot, and it's great if we had that huge beater, but didn't have evasion or trample for whatever reason. In any case, as if giving the virtuous roll wasn't enough, whenever an enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. So she's also another card advantage piece in the deck. So good. Speaking of lands helping get beaters through, Destiny Spinner can animate a land for just 4 mana. Until end of turn it becomes an XX elemental with trample, where X is the number of enchantments we control. Not only is this an amazing mana sink, but another way to close out games by creating huge beaters. As a bonus, it also makes our creature spells and enchantment spells uncounterable. Earlier I mentioned that the deck also creates plenty of creature tokens. This deck wants to win by beating down the board, and it makes good on that promise. While tokens don't trigger Gylwain, they're still bodies accumulated for chump blocking or attacking. Ajani's Chosen and Archon of Sun's Wraith each trigger on an enchantment entering the battlefield. The interesting thing about Ajani's Chosen is that if the enchantment were an aura, we could attach it to the cat token if we wanted to. While the cases are quite corner, it's still useful in those niche situations. The Archon creates 2/2 flyers, which is objectively better than 2/2 vanilla cats, especially since it also gives Pegasi we control lifelink. Siona, Captain of the Pyleas, also creates creature tokens, but only via auras getting attached to creatures we control, which is precisely what our commander does. And she doesn't just make vanilla 1/1s either. When she enters the battlefield, we can filter the top 7 cards of our library for an aura card. The deck doesn't have many, but digging this deep will certainly find any of the beater maker auras, mana acceleration auras, or interaction auras. The deck is running Darksteel Mutation and Song of the Dryads, which Siona can find and will trigger so many effects in the deck. These are amazing at getting rid of commanders since they don't change zones. They essentially become inert, rendering plenty of decks helpless, especially if they rely on their commander. But the deck is still running non-synergistic interaction like Beast Within, Generous Gift, and Stroke of Midnight. Interaction is super important and shouldn't be left to just synergy. These get rid of absolutely anything at instant speed, with the first 2 hitting lands, which is important against Maze of Ith effects with a deck like this one. Aura Shards is also in the deck. Not only does it synergize because it's an enchantment, but because it triggers on creatures entering the battlefield, which is great in a creature-heavy deck like this one. As for mana acceleration auras Siona can help get, the deck is running Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth. Each of these only costs 1 green to cast and help turn that enchanted land into a double mana land. The first one can only enchant forests, but the deck obviously has plenty of them. Yevamaya Cradle of Growth is also included to make sure we always have access to green. It's not only here solely for Utopia Sprawl, but it doesn't take up a slot. That being said, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits are obviously included as independent land-based ramp spells. You know I can't play green without my favorite ramp trifecta. That being said, Karametra, God of Harvest, can also ramp for basic type lands even if they're non-basic. Karametra triggers on creatures being cast, of which the deck has plenty. So we can get either Temple Guardian, Canopy Vista, Scattered Groves, Arctic Treeline, and Radiant Grove with her. You can also get Savannah if you had one, but it's definitely not necessary for the deck to run. Same with the 7 fetched lands in the deck. They help thin the deck of lands as well as guaranteeing that you'll always get double typed lands, but they're not entirely necessary for the deck to run. Karametra and the previously mentioned 5 double typed lands, that excluding Savannah, are good enough. Kodama of the West Tree does something similar, but whenever a modified creature deals combat damage to an opponent. While Kodama will only get us basic lands, that's okay because the deck has 6 of each basic land, so you could potentially ramp out all of the remaining basics in the deck with an Alpha Strike. Not only that, but Kodama also gives trample to our modified creatures. So if you switched any monster rolls into virtuous rolls, you still get that trample. Sanctum Weaver is the final mana acceleration piece in the deck and has the potential of tapping down for a ton of mana. This Serra Sanctums on a body is so good here, especially since it's also an enchantment, triggering both Constellation and Alliance effects. Speaking of, Serra's Sanctum and Gaia's Cradle do a ton of work in this deck, no surprise. Fortunately, however, you do not need them for the deck to run, and I personally don't have them in here, but you could if you had them and if you wanted to. Besides these core aspects of every commander deck, which are card advantage, interaction, and mana acceleration, the deck has some more spicy interactions to showcase. Skybind is an absolute house here. Its Constellation trigger has us exile target non-enchantment permanent until end of turn. This means that each creature that triggers Gylwain will also trigger Skybind, allowing us to clear any possible blockers or obstacles for that Alpha Strike. However, this can also be used for our own things. If we had creatures without rolls, any new creature entering will trigger Gylwain and the Skybind blinking that creature. It'll then return at the end of the turn in order to now get a roll for Gylwain. Your imagination's the limit with how you use Skybind here. Eerie Interlude and Semester's End are included because of how good the blink strategy is with Gylwain. We can choose what to blink at instant speed in order to have them enter and get a roll, or maybe a new one. However, since they're instants that delay blink, we can also cast these in response to a board wipe in order for our creatures to return afterwards. Not only that, but since they're all entering the battlefield at the same time, they can also trigger each other. So all of those Constellation and Alliance effects will all trigger at once for an explosion of stacky goodness. Speaking of protective effects, Clever Concealment, Teferi's Protection, Heroic Intervention, and Rampant Vigor are obviously included for the same reasons. The deck is a creature deck, so we want to do our best to ensure our armies remain healthy and ready to take out the table. Delay Blink is amazing, but these are straight to the point. One with the Kami, another spicy synergistic card in the deck, does some serious work here. If any of our enchanted creatures did bite the dust, then we create as many 1/1 spirits as power that creature had. This helps deter board wipes altogether, since we will probably be the only one with creatures left. Not only that, but a massive amount of creatures left, while everyone else has an empty board. And since it has Flash, you can do it in response to the board wipe for that pro gamer move. I love this card. Umbra Mystic also provides some synergistic protection against board wipes, and for literally zero effort, since each creature we control is probably enchanted and more than likely due to a roll. It even counts itself and lands since it's all permanents. Champion's Helm, Lightning Greaves, and Swiftfoot Boots are still included though, just to be thorough. The deck isn't entirely dependent on Gylwain, but it's good to make sure he survives long enough and as often as possible to get us the win. And if something did manage to die, we have Balaged Recovery and Mistveiled Plains for that. Neither of these take up a slot on the deck so long as you aren't greedy and play Balaged as a land if you missed your land drop that turn. Best of all, Mistveiled Plains is fetchable, whether from a fetch land or Karametra. Sphere of Safety is another synergistic protective card in the deck thanks to Gylwain. With enough creatures having a roll, the value of X from this enchantment might be too high for anyone to attack us, meaning that they'll either have to try and keep blockers up from us or attack elsewhere for their combat triggers. Don't sleep on this one here. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running Wooded Bastion, Sunpetal Grove, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb apart from all of the previously mentioned lands. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Gylwain Casting Director. While the face commander for the precon is strong in her own right, I absolutely loved Gylwain when I saw the card. I love the new role mechanic and it opens up so many doors for so many spicy interactions. Particularly in this deck since you're essentially getting 2 cards for 1 when you cast a creature. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check the links in the description too, that also helps out the channel. Especially if you want to pre-order the Green-White Wilds of Eldraine precon, do so via the sponsored link at no extra cost to you. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Method Kirby, and happy brewing.